The sun, like a searing ember, scorched even the deepest shadows on the sweltering sidewalks of Harlem. This city, alive with the irrepressible rhythm of jazz, pulsing with a passion for freedom, and steeped in the profound pain of age-old oppression, stood on the precipice of change. 65. America, torn by the civil rights debate, found itself at a crucial turning point in history, and at the very heart of this bubbling cauldron of passions and contradictions stood Malcolm X, a man whose name became inextricably linked with struggle, whose fiery rhetoric ignited hope in hearts, and whose remarkable transformation stirred minds. He was not merely a leader, he was a true symbol, a shining beacon for millions of Black Americans, and his voice, sounding like a mighty clap of thunder, ruthlessly swept away centuries of chains. But on this fateful day, the 21st of February, in the spacious Odeon Hall of the renowned Unitedin Theater, where Malcolm was preparing to deliver another inspiring speech, that voice was irrevocably silenced. Imagine the atmosphere. The air seemed to crackle with anticipation. The hall buzzed with the arrival of people eager to hear the words of their unconquered leader. Malcolm, the embodiment of strength and confidence, stood on stage, ready to share his most profound thoughts. And then, suddenly, the deafening roar of gunshots, chaos, panic, piercing screams. Someone fell, someone fled, trying to grasp what had happened. This was not just a shot directed at a man. It was a blow that shook the foundations of an entire movement, burying the hopes of millions. Later, when the dust settled and the initial shock gave way to understanding, the world would learn the sorrowful news. Malcolm X was dead. But by whom? And more importantly, why? These questions, like a venomous, omnipresent fog, would envelop this case, fueling endless disputes, spawning sinister theories, and leaving behind a tangle of unsolvable mysteries. The investigation began immediately. Yet, as often happens in cases so high-profile and steeped in sharp political subtext, it was far from flawless. The first moments after the tragedy were marked by overwhelming disarray. The people who found themselves in the hall at that fateful moment tried to describe the attackers, but their testimonies were scattered, like shards of a broken mirror, contradicting one another. Amidst the crowd, gripped by panic and utter confusion, it was incredibly difficult to discern even the slightest glimmer of truth. Suspicion first fell, naturally, upon members of the Nation of Islam, an organization Malcolm once belonged to, before sharply and mercilessly criticizing it. At first glance, the motive seemed utterly obvious: betrayal and a thirst for revenge. But how often is what lies on the surface the actual truth? Talib Azzam was the first to be taken into custody, as quite a few witnesses confidently identified him as one of those who had opened fire. Following him, Norman X was arrested, also inextricably linked to this audacious crime. The third suspected participant in the attack, Michael Fair, was wounded on the same day, and soon he too found himself behind bars. All three of them were members of the Nation of Islam, and all three were charged. At the trial, the defense was built upon a categorical denial of guilt, on presented alibis, on assurances that they were merely pawns in someone else's far grander game. The prosecutors, confidently relying on eyewitness testimony and evidence such as the recovered weapon, aimed to secure a guilty verdict. However, the deeper the investigators delved into the intricacies of this tangled affair, the more unanswered questions arose before them. Why was the weapon found with one of the suspects in such a dilapidated state that it could hardly have fired those fatal shots? Why did some witnesses confidently identify certain individuals, while others saw entirely different people? Could this have been a meticulously planned, coordinated operation, aimed not only at eliminating Malcolm, but also at discrediting his fervent supporters, sowing seeds of chaos and discord among them. Imagine the unbearable burden faced by those who sincerely believed in Malcolm's cause. In his assassination, they saw not merely a common crime, but an act of political violence intended to suppress the nascent movement for black rights. They yearned for justice, but their path was paved with walls of misunderstanding, distrust, and sordid political games. And all of this unfolded at a time when it seemed America itself stood on the precipice of profound change. Malcolm X himself, whose true name was Malcolm Little, had journeyed through a truly remarkable path. From a street urchin convicted of robbery, he transformed into a charismatic leader whose ideas of self-defense and black pride ignited hearts and inspired millions. His decision to leave the Nation of Islam was a loud and painful event, leaving a deep scar. He began to criticize the organization's leader, Elijah Muhammad, accusing him of hypocrisy and abuse of power. This audacious criticism, naturally, did not go unnoticed. Malcolm received grim threats, acutely aware that he was a target, like a marked man. Yet, he continued his path, unwavering in his belief in his mission and righteousness. Was his tragic death an act of retribution from the Nation of Islam? This is perhaps the most common and, at first glance, logical version of events. But what if there was something more to this story? What if in the shadows operated other, far more influential forces, with a vested interest in eliminating such a bright and influential voice capable of changing the course of history? Speculation continued to swirl, giving rise to endless new theories. Whispers spoke of FBI involvement, covert CIA operations, and the influence of local criminal organizations whose interests might also have been affected. These theories, fueled by a lack of transparency and the perplexing aspects of the investigation, only amplified public outcry and deepened distrust in the official account. The Malcolm X case truly mirrored its era, an era when racial issues were particularly sharp. The fight for civil rights faced constant pressure, and even the brightest stars could be extinguished suddenly and tragically. For Malcolm's supporters, those days were steeped in sorrow, a yearning for answers, and a profound sense of injustice. They adamantly refused to believe that just 3 individuals, linked to the Nation of Islam, could be the sole perpetrators. Where was the mastermind? Who orchestrated this sinister conspiracy? The trial of Azzam, Norman III X, and Fane, held in 1966, was taut with suspense. The prosecution methodically presented its evidence, while the defense desperately attempted to refute it. Witness testimonies were heard in court. Testimonies that, as previously mentioned, proved quite contradictory and vague. Evidence existed that raised not only questions, but also serious doubts. And of course, there was Malcolm X himself. His complex life, his bold ideas, his tragic death. All of it cast an indelible, profound shadow over the entire court proceedings. Ultimately, a verdict was reached. Talib Azzam, Norman III X, and Michael Finan were found guilty of the murder of Malcolm X. They were sentenced to life imprisonment. At first glance, it seemed the case was closed, and justice had prevailed. The guilty had received their just deserts. However, for many people, this was merely a formal conclusion, not a true revelation of the entire truth. Many years later, in the 21st century, new evidence and entirely unexpected versions of events began to emerge. Some drew upon declassified government documents, while others relied on personal recollections from former members of the Nation of Islam. Serious allegations emerged, suggesting the assassination was not only planned from within the organization, but also involved unknown external forces. There were opinions that Azzam and Norman III X might have been innocent, used, and that they had fallen victim to a setup. One of the most significant questions, which still captivates many, concerns the identity of Fain. He sustained injuries during that fateful shooting and is generally believed to have been the first to open fire. However, his testimony was incomplete, and his motives remain entirely unclear. Were there other shooters who were never identified? Was Fain merely a pawn in a much more complex, intricate scheme? It is personally unclear to me how, in such a high-profile case with so many witnesses, such substantial gaps in evidence could persist. Just imagine, you are a leader, you go to meet your people, and you are killed. And years later, you and your loyal supporters still do not know the full truth. This is not just a crime. It is a profound trauma that simply will not heal. The case of Malcolm X is not merely a story of political assassination. It is a narrative of a fervent struggle for fundamental rights, a torturous quest for self-identity, the fragility of trust, and the insidious nature of betrayal. It tells of how cruelly the brightest star can be extinguished when forces conspiring against its brilliance act unseen, like shadows. It compels us to ponder how easily ideals can crumble before the onslaught of cynical, twisted reality, and how vital it is to pursue absolute, unblemished justice, even if the path is endless and thorny. Malcolm X's legacy endures. His ideas continue to ignite hearts and awaken souls. But his untimely passing remains an open wound, an eternal reminder of the immense price paid for unwavering devotion to true freedom. And until all the agonizing questions are answered, until the shadows of the past are dispelled, revealing the true perpetrators, the case of Malcolm X will burn eternally in our hearts and minds, reminding each of